Hello, I'm here in Chiang Mai, Thailand, with Michel Bauwens, the founder and coordinator of the Peer-to-Peer Foundation, which has a website which is worth going to. Michel has been following the Occupy Wall Street movement quite intensively, and you can also go to his website to learn more about this. But my first question to you, Michel, is what's the importance of Occupy Wall Street from your perspective?
Okay, well, there's two different aspects. I think one is a sociological aspect, because in my view, all the other social movements that we have are rooted in the past. So we have a labor movement which is rooted in 19th century social structures.
Mm-hmm.
We have identity movements which were rooted in the 60s and let's say the conditions of mass media development. But we now have a native movement of people who are rooted in the structure of cognitive capitalism and peer-to-peer socialization and media. Yeah, so I think that Occupy Wall Street is significant for two main reasons. One is let's say an external sociological reason, because I think that all the other social movements that we have, like the labor movement, are rooted in the social conditions of the 19th century. We have 60s identity movements, which I think are rooted in the mass media developments.
Mm-hmm.
And we didn't have a native social movement for the sphere and phase of cognitive capitalism. And I think that the people sociologically who are active in the Wall Street movement and in the Indignados movement in Spain are those young knowledge workers who are precarious, performing knowledge work, and have quite a different social positioning within the system that industrial workers would have had, or people in the 60s.
So can you identify the difference between the traditional perspective on capitalism and cognitive capitalism?
Well, I think the way cognitive capitalism is identified is that the value creation is dependent on knowledge and a control of knowledge. So if you look today at where the money is being made, the profit margins in industry are very, very low. The money is made through intellectual property protection. And you look at Apple, and you see the Chinese companies making just a few cents on the dollar, and you see that 70% of the profit mass is going to the people who are holding intellectual property and coordinating the global efforts, and then the financialization aspect, right? So this, I think, is pretty new. And then also the fact that industrial workers in the West are a minority. They're 17 to 23% of Europe versus in America. While the majority of people are either in service, but there's a sizable chunk, I think about 40%, that are knowledge workers, people who produce knowledge with knowledge.
Right. So it's no longer hardware which really matters. You need it, of course, but the software is even more important.
Yes, yes. And then the other important thing, and this brings me to the second part of my analysis, more the internal features of Occupy Wall Street, is that this generation has been socialized through peer-to-peer media. The ability for permissionless self-aggregation and working together on all kinds of topics, either within or outside of the working sphere.
Mm-hmm.
And if you look at the way that Occupy Wall Street functions, it's almost like a template for what I call peer production and how open source software is produced. So just briefly, in open source you have the value is created in a commons. You have code which is produced using a special kind of license which obliges people to share the code. So that's where the knowledge is deposited. It's no longer private intellectual property.
Right.
And then you have usually provisioning systems, I call them for benefit organizations like the Wikimedia Foundation or the Linux Foundation, who manage the infrastructure of cooperation. And then you have the entrepreneurial coalitions who make value on top of the commons, on top of the code base, which is common to all participants.
All right.
And now if you look at Occupy Wall Street, the way it functions, and my knowledge is based mainly on visiting and talking to the people in New York and London.
Okay.
So, but I saw it, especially in London, in New York, it functioned really in that way. So The core of Occupy Wall Street is a production of a political commons by contributors and using the general assembly system to arrive at a consensus of what that commons is about. Right? Then you see a whole series of provisioning systems. You have the financial working group, you have the free software working group, you have the media working group, you have the food working group, you have the health. They even had healthcare for pets. So these are the 4 benefit institutions, and I want to give you an example to show you how unique this is. So these people needed food, and they found a network of people in Vermont, organic farmers, who were willing to provide food for free to the community at Liberty Park. And they also found cooks, hundreds of cooks, who were willing to prepare the food for them.
Mm-hmm.
Now this created a problem. The problem was that around Zuccotti Park you have street vendors, and selling pretzels and hot dogs and stuff like that. And of course, the fact that the people would get free food would have a negative impact on those vendors. And these vendors are usually first-generation immigrants, working long hours, probably not making a lot of money. So what the provisioning group did was to decide that to gather finances in order to buy food from the street vendors, and it's called the Occupy Wall Street Street Vendor Project. And this is very interesting because this means that it's the citizens, through their provisioning system and the dialogue that they have as citizens, that decide on the economy. Right? So they created an ethical economy. There was a market, but the market was subsumed to the ethical guidelines and decisions of citizens in dialogue. And so in this sense, this kind of internal characteristic where you have the commons as the core, provisioning systems and entrepreneurial coalition that is subsumed to the commons, for me this is prefigurative politics. This is creating and using templates which are active in open source, they are active in political mobilizations, they are active in open hardware, they are active in urban gardening. And what I see in this is, of course, kind of a prefiguration of how society could be organized. This is, of course, a hypothetical step, but I think this is what Occupy Wall Street shows, and it shows that it was effective and that it was working.
But can it be multiplied? Can it be enlarged to a global phenomenon?
Well, for that we would have to look to the open source software and hardware worlds, and to this emergence of also what's called collaborative consumption, where we see different things happening. We see the development of all kinds of alternative market formats like social entrepreneurship, fair trade, B corporations. We see new funding mechanisms, crowdfunding, which was used by Obama in his election, the last election.
And now by the Republicans.
And now it's used by the Republicans. So distributed access to funding from the citizens themselves directly. You have there's the emergence of the commons as a paradigm. So all these things are emerging in a wide area of social fields, but where they are coalescing the best is in open source software production, increasingly in open hardware production. So in software, this modality is pretty much becoming mainstream. It's no longer emerging. It's there is a report on the fair use open content economy, which includes open content and open software, which calculates GDP as 1/6 of GDP in the US, which is a pretty significant part of it. And this industry has that structure, a code of commons, companies that work with that commons, and they have these what we call floss foundations.
Right.
Now, politically, I think Occupy Wall Street still needs to evolve. I mean, it's a start, and I still have strong doubts around the consensus methodology and the assemblies, because we have historical precedents in Argentina, in Greece, in Spain, and they don't seem to last very long. So I think they probably will experiment with different forms of governance that allow them to be more efficient in terms of social action.
Right. Yeah, can you elaborate a bit more on that? Because we've also seen in Egypt, for instance, that we may enter the second phase there, which is again suppression rather than liberation.
Well, I mean, if you look at revolutions historically, this is nothing new. If you look at the French Revolution, the Russian Revolution, there's always different phases, and some fail and some succeed, and so I think this is pretty much a normal social struggle.
But the existence of what you call the social networks, the media, which contribute to the debates and the discussion, may affect it.
The key is the ability of those movements to create alternative social institutions. So, just to use an historical example, you have, let's say, at the end of the Middle Ages and the religious civil wars in the 15th, 16th, 17th century, you have a decline of the classic medieval institutions.
Right.
You have the emergence of a republic of letters, but it's a very informal, unstable process. And then it will eventually get institutionalized and formalized in the Royal Academies and the research university model pretty much in the 19th, end of the 18th and 19th, and then the 19th century. So here we're in the in-between phase where we have a decline of traditional institutions, we have the emergence of something new, but it's still very informal. But in open source we can see that there is a consolidation of an institutional framework, right? And if you look at the labor movement, there was a very wide variety of forms in the 19th century, then eventually it kind of consolidates into social democratic, communist and anarchist movements which have a kind of particular structure.
Right.
So I think what we need to find and experiment with is what is the appropriate institutional framework which maintains a balance between the individual and the collective, right? In open source, I think the social innovation of open source is that it eliminates consent. It eliminates a need for discussion where it's not needed. So there is in open source what you have is a level. First level is called stigmergy. It's the signaling systems which allow people to know what they have to do. There's no command and control in terms of the production process. People aggregate, choose their tasks, perform them, right? And then when there's a conflict, there's a negotiated coordination happening through the mailing lists and the forums, and they hash out their conflicts and they find solutions, and then they build rules. Like with the Wikipedia, there's lots of rules, now showing how things should be done. So that kind of process then consolidates an institutional framework, right? And I think that within Occupy Wall Street, I may be wrong, but that the balance is so much on the collective still, which may have been necessary and was probably necessary to maintain the unity of this movement. And that's what made the success of the movement, was the ability to create a broad enough framework and paradigm that many different social forces could find themselves within it.
Yeah, one of the critiques from the media, especially in the US, was that there is no mission, there is no clear objective of the movement, and the organizers or the people involved, they always resisted that kind of answering. But at the same time, what you're just telling me, if I make the comparison to the discussion in the university academic field with the need for quality control, peer review as a standard to assess the quality of certain publications and products. Now that's in a way a more elitist approach to democratic development. Isn't that needed in such a movement as well?
Yes, but you have that in open source production. What you have, but there's a kind of in the classic model you have credentialism, like in academia. So you need a certain formalized agreement in order to actually be able to produce and work together. You need to be hired. You need to have your PhD.
Right.
There's a lot of conditions. While the open source model is anti-credentialist. So people aggregate to a particular task they can perform, and the selection mechanisms are moved after the input.
Right.
So instead of having a quality control up front, the quality control comes at the end. And for example, in software you have committers, maintainers. In Wikipedia you have the editors. So you do have those selection mechanisms, but I'm not sure they have them in Occupy Wall Street.
Right.
But I think the social issue that Occupy Wall Street has to tackle is diversity, right? Diversity of people with different politics. And so what do you do if you don't agree on the solution? Well, then the common ground is democracy. So it's the democratic practice which allows diversity to exist. And so I think that's what they do. Since they know they disagree with each other, they know what they're against, but they don't necessarily know what they're for. And therefore, the solution is, well, at least we need a process where that diversity can be aired and encountered and going into a dialogue with each other. And I think that's what they are doing. I don't want to paint a too negative picture either, because what you see with the assembly movement is that when the central dynamic of the occupations diminishes, either because of repression or because it's winter time, but what you see is a spread of the movement in the neighborhoods and in all kinds of micro situations, like in Greece and in Spain. There's certainly a very active neighborhood assembly movement. In the United States there is an anti-enclosure movement in housing against expulsions.
Foreclosure, yeah.
So a lot of these people do not become passive. They are there, they are active on a more local level, and they can coalesce again.
Yeah, so you're saying that it's now Occupy everything, so to speak.
Yeah.
But the question then becomes, like in every social movement, how to keep the momentum going,
Yes.
How to create the different triggers which need to be maintained to get people involved.
Right. So what I'm advocating, and I'm not sure this is happening on a massive scale yet, but so you have, I think, three components. You have a component of mass mobilization, and that we see it happen. Then there's a component for me of social reconstruction, of what are those practices that we want, and so you exemplify them to prefigurative social practices, and that's what peer production is about. So we have radical urban gardening, we have P2P oriented social movements in many different fields, but they're not necessarily connected yet to the mass movements, right? And then you have a third component for me is the policy interventions,
Right.
changing the laws and institutions which enable or disable these kind of new social practices that we want. So we see three separate developments. We see Occupy Wall Street and Indignados in the mobilization field. We see peer production as a prefigurative practice, and then we see the pirate parties, for example, as one example of a policy orientation. We should not forget that the pirate parties have the majority of the vote of the young people between 18 and 35, both in Sweden and in Germany. They have 10% in Germany, in Berlin. But the polls show that they would have 6% nationwide in the next election, and they have a very strong influence in the youth vote. Even though, because of the demographic structure, Europe may seem to move to the left overall because the older people. But when you look at the youth vote, it's amazing how aligned they are with these new values of peer-to-peer, free culture, and the commons.
You said there's a movement towards the left, while nowadays the opposite tends to be the case.
That's what I'm saying. You have to look at, for example, I read an analysis on Spain, and in Spain, the social democratic forces collapsed, and the right wing won, But if you look at the youth vote, there's a totally different picture. The youth vote went either left or in abstention, but in political abstention, in conscious vote of abstention as a sign of dissatisfaction with politics.
Right.
And so this rightward drift is not happening with the young generation. Even in the United States, there is a divorce. We see that the older people are moving more to the Republicans, and the younger people are increasingly voting Democrat. So I think these are pretty strong sociological trends that are, it takes some time for these people to grow up and then influence the wider culture.
Although there's also a bit of a structural assessment which normally indicates that people, when growing older, become more conservative or more traditional in their preferences and voting habits.
I think this is also depends on the possibilities that society offers for integration.
Right.
And my fear and maybe my hope is that this is no longer the case. In other words, that we have to remember in the 60s, which is your generation and my generation, I guess, we were politically active in a context of growth. And so we could be bought off, we could be offered jobs in institutions, and we could have the idea that we could do progressive work within an institutional framework that was rewarding. But if you look at the level of precarity in the young generations, this is just not the case.
Right.
So there is, I would argue the opposite is happening. There is more unemployment, higher fees for education. So there is a social regression going on, which makes that scenario of integration unlikely.
Less likely, yeah.
And then the question is, how adaptive is the system to respond to those new social demands, right? And I think the system is not very adaptive. I mean, you look at the meltdown, and you can't really say that a lot of things are happening, around the structural causes of the meltdown, right? So when you don't have a soft adaptation, you actually prepare the ground for social confrontation, and I think this is pretty much in the cards for the future.
Right. If I may bring in the so-called traditional left or labor unions, etc., again, because in the context of Occupy Wall Street, it was said that that created a second push for the movement. The first push may have been the violence exercised by the police, so to speak. But of course, they come in with their own agendas and their own objectives. So how can you create a movement which facilitates or accepts all these different agendas, explicit or implicit?
Well, that's a good question, but I think that the political expressions will evolve, and again I would use the example of the Pirate Party as one example, or how this can happen. I went to Brazil recently, and there was an interesting movement there called Fora do Exo, which means out of the axis. And these are young musicians and cultural producers who mutualize their infrastructure, use an alternative currency system to exchange among each other. So for example, I have a guitar, you have a studio, you can use my guitar and I use your studio, right? This kind of dynamic is happening. And so they have an integrated counter economy within Brazil, and they organize huge music festivals, and lots of them, hundreds a year. And these people in Brazil are becoming political. And I heard they are fielding candidates now at the local level. But I also attended a conference where they were challenging directly the representative of the Ministry of Culture in a very vocal way. So you can see that there is politicization going on, that these social movements do not stay, just because of their life experience. I mean, the Pirate Party is a direct expression of resistance to the legal oppression of file sharing. Right. It's because these people were put in prison and fined that it created an outrage amongst the young population, and that fed the creation of the Pirate Party. In the same way, in Brazil they had a very progressive cultural policy under Lula. It's been reversed by the new Minister of Culture, and this creates the reaction of the social field and the politicization of that movement, which wasn't political in the beginning.
Right.
If you look at the French Revolution, it grew out of the frustration also because things that people thought were normal were actually illegal. For example, I was reading an interesting article that about 10,000 French people were tortured and executed because they used illegal fabrics that had royal monopolies, right? So in one day, in the assembly, when les États généraux came together, they abolished all feudal privileges in one day. And this is what young people are experiencing today. You want to do urban gardening, you can. It's illegal to have a garden in front of your house. You want to do a car sharing, it's illegal because you can't get an insurance for your hosts. You want to dry your clothes in the sun because that's ecologically sustainable. You can because there's a rule that it lowers the real estate value of your village. You want to collect the rainwater, it's illegal. So we have an institutional structure which makes things that appear to be very normal into an illegal practice, and that creates a politicization of the people involved.
But that implies that you need to take the conscience of people up to the level of up to a certain point abstraction that they can aim for.
I think that will happen. I think that the pressing need of the Occupy Wall Street movement was first of all to express this social dissatisfaction, which was there, but which couldn't find an expression, and it has been extraordinarily successful in changing the terms of the debate in the U.S. Social justice was not on the agenda; it was dead. And now, if there have been studies on that, like how many times a number concept appears in the media. Now it's on the agenda. It's actually the primary agenda in the U.S. and so they've been successful, but it's just a phase. It's a phase in a development of a new type of social movement.
Yeah, indeed, and it's to be seen whether that can be maintained on the long term, given the short-term kind of interest by media and people in general. But you've already made a connection to Brazil. Can you argue, or can you make the claim that this movement is now more or less a global movement, or a movement which has its connections everywhere?
Not necessarily Occupy Wall Street itself, because what you've seen is the Arab Spring, then it moved to Europe with Spain and Greece, especially with the Indignados and Syntagma Square. Then it moved to the U.S. But outside the Anglo-Saxon world, Occupy does not seem to generate a lot. It does generate interest, but it doesn't generate emulation.
Right.
Like in Brazil, it was very small, the Occupy movement. But they have their own. They have their own movements. And what's interesting for me is that in Europe and the US, we have a very strong and active, hackers class. The technical youth who are very conscious of their values and working in terms of open source and free software and all of that. But they're not very overtly political. And they're operating in an environment where the demographic structure is negative for them. In other words, youth are a minority and people are growing older and becoming more conservative and more fearful.
Right.
This makes it very difficult in the European situation for young people to make their voice heard. But if you look at the South, it's completely different. The majority of the people are under 30 or under 25, sometimes more than 50%. And also their social systems are not as fully developed and not as fully set as in Europe. So for me, what was very surprising in Brazil was the ongoing dialogue between free culture and the institutional world. People are talking to each other. Sometimes they're shouting, but they're listening to each other. Where in Europe, my experience has been much more kind of a dual world, where you have an elite which has seemingly no clue. You look at France.
There's a disconnect.
In France, they have the most bloggers in the world. But if you look at the newspapers, they still make fun of Wikipedia.
Right.
You know, you still have this strong cultural generation disconnect, and there's a connection between, let's say, the open source world and left sensitivity, which is very strong in Latin America, which may not necessarily exist in Europe or the US.
Yeah.
So each culture brings another imprint on these social developments. Like in Asia, there is a very strong push towards material wealth, and so it's completely different. It's very pragmatic here. You look at the Shanzai economy in China. It's a legal or illegal open source economy which produces very innovative mobile phones. You can buy electric cars in every city in China for $3,000-$4,000.
Right.
So it's a very active, strong culture, but it's absolutely not politicized. It's all centered around resilience, making money, working together to make money, copy and innovate. It doesn't have the self-consciousness that you find.
There's also probably less of a tradition and an availability of technological facilities. So the use they make of social networks is different given the culture and history and the economic situation.
Yes. Although I wouldn't underestimate the level of penetration in some countries.
Mm-hmm.
Certainly in China, I recently read that more white-collar workers blog in China than in the West.
Mm-hmm.
So it depends on the specific social situation. In some, like in Thailand, you pretty much find internet cafes everywhere. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
even in the mountain region here in the north, you'll find, people use it differently, but they use Skype to connect with their families in Bangkok.
Right.
It would be wrong to think that it has no influence.
No, I'm not making that claim, but what I try to argue is that technology can only play a facilitating role up to a certain point,
Yes.
can disseminate messages in a larger environment, but in the end it's still people who have to make the change.
Of course, yeah. And that's why Egypt is also so interesting, because what I've read about the background is amongst the effects that media had was the fact that social media allowed the Islamic culture, Muslim Brotherhood type of people, to connect with human rights activists, and they had never done that before.
Right.
It also created these youth movements, right? And then when the movement really starts on the streets is the day that they prohibit the internet, that they disable it. That's when all those young people go out in the streets with pickup trucks and go to the working class neighborhoods. So there's this dialectic between the virtual and the physical, they're not separated, and they feed each other. And then of course you have the role of Al Jazeera. So it's a complex story, but I do think that that media are very important. Somebody told me that Luther said, I would thank God for the gift of the printing press, right? So he was very conscious that the Reformation and the fact that his ideas could spread so fast in relative terms for the time were strongly linked to the availability of a particular technology. And if you look at the Russian Revolution, the press was very important. The Bolshevik Party was organized around its newspapers.
Right.
That was the key vehicle. The production and the funding of the newspaper was what coalesced the efforts of revolutionary movements in that time, right?